The world woke up to fire. Not a metaphor, not a political flare-up, but actual, billowing, catastrophic fire in the heart of the global energy grid. Satellite imagery, the cold, unblinking eye in the sky, captured it all. The Ras Laffan industrial complex in Qatar, one of the single most critical nodes for liquefied natural gas on the planet, was engulfed in a series of violent, expanding plumes of smoke and flame. The initial thermal signatures suggested not an accident, but a targeted, simultaneous detonation. This was the POV from orbit, and it spelled one thing: chaos. On the ground, the scale was biblical. Reports from Qatari state media, terse and shaken, spoke of a major incident and emergency response. But the market doesn't deal in euphemisms. Within minutes of the opening bell in Asia, the digital tickers went haywire. European natural gas futures, the benchmark, screamed upward by over 40% in a single vertigo-inducing spike. Brent crude followed, leaping 8% as traders priced in the geopolitical shockwave rippling from the Persian Gulf. The financial anchors, their usual polished calm shattered, were practically shouting over each other, trying to explain the numbers flashing red and green behind them. This wasn't just a market move, it was a system in cardiac arrest. The global economy, already walking a tightrope, just felt the rope snap. And here's where the real story begins. Because while the flames licked the sky and the algorithms panicked, a profound and dangerous silence descended in the halls of power. The question, the only question that mattered, hung in the air, thick as the smoke over Ras Laffan. Who? Initial forensic reports, according to intelligence sources speaking on background to CNN, pointed to catastrophic precision damage to multiple liquefaction trains, the heart of the facility. This wasn't a stray rocket. This was a sophisticated, coordinated strike. But the attribution? Radio silence. The usual suspects lined up in the global imagination, but no one was taking credit. Not officially. Was it a state actor testing the West's resolve, a brutal demonstration of how to hold a winter continent hostage with a single strike? Was it a non-state group with capabilities that just rewrote the rulebook on energy terrorism? The chatter in intelligence circles, we're told, is a cacophony of conflicting whispers. The Iranians are on high alert, denying everything. The Houthis, for once, aren't boasting. Even the usual online haunts of extremist groups are quiet, which in itself is deafening. So we're left with this: a smoldering ruin at the center of the world's energy supply, a financial system in freefall reacting to the physics of fear, and a vacuum of responsibility. The response so far is paralysis by analysis. To understand the magnitude of the shockwave now rippling through every capital and trading floor, you have to understand what was lost. The Rosvan liquefaction terminal wasn't just another facility, it was the beating heart of a global circulatory system. Think of it as the grand central station of natural gas. Perched on the coast, it was the single largest nexus where pipelines from the vast eastern fields converged. Here, gas was supercooled into a liquid, shrinking its volume 600-fold and loaded onto specialized tankers, floating pipelines, that could sail anywhere in the world. 40% of Trans-Eurasia's gas exports flowed through Rosvan. It powered German industry, heated British homes, and fueled South Korean manufacturing. Its strategic importance wasn't just economic, it was geopolitical bedrock. For decades, it was the primary tether of energy interdependence between East and West, a multi-billion-dollar reason to maintain a tense but functional peace. Its destruction wasn't an attack on a single nation's infrastructure. It was a precision strike against the foundational architecture of globalized energy. The immediate economic shock was both historic and instantaneous. Before the fires were even contained, the financial markets began convulsing with the physics of pure fear. The benchmark price for liquefied natural gas in Asia, the JKM spot price, executed a vertical climb that veteran traders described as unprecedented. Within the first 12 hours of trading after the attack, it spiked a staggering 42%. In Europe, the Dutch TTF gas futures, the continent's primary benchmark, mirrored the chaos, soaring over 35%. The trading floors in London, Singapore, and Chicago descended into a state of controlled bedlam. One energy analyst on a financial news network called it, and I quote, "the moment the market's central nervous system was severed." Early market panic manifested in a brutal, predictable scramble. Energy ministers across the European Union initiated emergency calls, activating long-dormant contingency plans that suddenly seemed woefully inadequate. Utilities and national buyers, facing the terrifying prospect of winter contracts they could no longer fulfill, began desperately bidding for any available cargo not already en route to Rosvan. This sent spot prices for Atlantic Basin LNG from the US and Qatar into their own parabolic rise. The domino effect began. Shares in major European utilities and heavy industrial consumers, chemical plants, steelmakers, plummeted. Conversely, stocks in alternative energy firms and, grimly, companies specializing in security and defense contracting saw sharp upticks. This is where we shift from the what to the how. And the how, according to the forensic analysts now swarming over every digital shred of evidence, is nothing short of terrifying in its precision. Investigators from a joint NATO Cyber Command task force speaking on deep background point to three chillingly sophisticated attack vectors that converge simultaneously on the Trans-European Pipeline's control systems. First, the initial breach. The intrusion point, we're told, was a so-called zero-day exploit in the industrial control system software, the kind of digital skeleton key that is not discovered by hackers, but developed at immense cost by nation-state intelligence agencies. It allowed the attackers to slip past multiple layers of next-generation firewalls and anomaly detection systems without tripping a single alarm. They were ghosts in the machine for months, mapping every valve, every pressure sensor, every emergency shutoff protocol. Second, the weaponization of operational technology. This is the key difference between hacking a bank and hacking a pipeline. They didn't just steal data, they manipulated the physical world. The forensic analysis shows they didn't simply turn off the pumps, they orchestrated a cascade of failures designed to look like a catastrophic mechanical accident. They subtly tweaked pressure readings in one compressor station, forcing automatic systems to overcompensate downstream. They introduced malicious code into the programmable logic controllers, the tiny, rugged computers that directly open and close valves, that cause them to execute a sequence of commands at a precise, coordinated moment. One source close to the investigation described it to me as, quote, writing a symphony of destruction where every instrument was a piece of critical infrastructure, and they conducted it perfectly. Third, the cover-up and the kill switch. After the sabotage sequence was initiated, the malware didn't just sit there. It began a systematic, multi-stage self-destruction routine, overwriting its own code with digital gibberish to frustrate forensic recovery. But not before it planted false flag code fragments, obvious, clumsy bits of Russian and Chinese hacking tools, a classic piece of misdirection, a digital gaslighting attempt on a global scale. The sophistication here is mind-bending. This wasn't just about breaking in and blowing things up. It was about controlling the narrative of the investigation from the start. We brought this technical data to Dr. Eris Thorne, former head of offensive cyber operations at the Pentagon and now a leading private sector analyst. His analysis was blunt. Dr. Eris Thorne leaned back in his chair, the glow of his monitor reflecting in his glasses. He didn't mince words. The false flags are amateur hour, he said, his voice flat. But that's the point. They're too amateur. It's a triple bluff. You see Russian bear code, you see Chinese red sun fragments. That's not a signature. That's a neon sign pointing away from the real architect. This level of operational security, this multi-stage digital vanishing act, we're not looking at a criminal syndicate. We're looking at a national intelligence service with something massive to gain and even more to lose. His statement brings us to the heart of tonight's deep dive, the geopolitical chessboard. Who has the motive and who has the capability to execute an attack of this precision and ambition? The list is short and the implications are explosive. First, the regional context. The Trans-Pacific Energy Bridge wasn't just a pipeline, it was a geopolitical instrument. For decades, the nations along the Meridian Sea have been locked in a tense, low-grade Cold War over undersea energy reserves and strategic shipping lanes. The pipeline's route deliberately bypassed the territorial waters of the Republic of Viridia, a nation with a long-standing, bitter maritime dispute with its neighbor, the Federation of Laurentia. The pipeline's success would have cemented Laurentia as the region's dominant energy hub, economically isolating Viridia and its allies. The motive for Viridia to disrupt this project is, as one State Department analyst put it to us on background, glaringly obvious. But capability is another matter. Viridia's cyber forces, known as Digital Hydra, are competent, aggressive, and have a history of disruptive attacks against Laurentian infrastructure. But the forensic consensus from 3 private intelligence firms we consulted is that Hydra's past operations lack the elegant, physics-aware lethality seen here. They're brutes. This attack was a surgeon. This shifts the spotlight to state actors with a longer reach and a history of targeting critical energy infrastructure globally. The usual suspects emerge from the shadows. There's the Eastern Collective, a resurgent power bloc whose state-sponsored hacking groups like Void Choir and Jade Locus are consistently ranked among the world's most advanced. Their motive? To demonstrate that Western-led energy projects are vulnerable, to sow discord among allies, and to position their own alternative energy networks as more secure. The historical precedent is stark. The 2027 takedown of the Baltic grid, attributed to Void Choir, used a similar, though less sophisticated malware that manipulated safety tolerances in transformer stations, causing a cascade failure. The playbook exists. The digital shockwave from the Arctic breach didn't stay in the Arctic. It traveled at fiber optic speed, hitting the nerve centers of global power. And the reaction? Let's just say the vibe in Brussels and Washington shifted from concerned monitoring to full-blown DEFCON 2 panic in under 6 hours. This wasn't just an energy story anymore. It was a live-fire stress test of the entire globalized system, and the first cracks were already spiderwebbing across the map. In Brussels, emergency lights burned late into the night at the Berlaymont building. The European Commission, still nursing a collective trauma from the gas crises of the 2020s, convened an emergency energy council. The agenda was a single, terrifying slide: projected depletion rates of the strategic gas reserve. The numbers were a gut punch. With the polar vortex flow, a river of cheap, stable LNG that Europe had banked its winter on, now reduced to a digital ghost, the calculus changed. A source inside the meeting, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the atmosphere as sober to the point of grim. The data showed that if alternative supplies from the US and Qatar couldn't be secured at a massive scale and fast, several member states would begin tapping their emergency reserves by mid-December. Not in January, not in February. December. Winter would have barely begun. Meanwhile, across the pond, the Situation Room in the White House basement was humming. This was a POV from the top, and the view was ugly. The president's national security advisor wasn't just looking at energy charts, she was looking at a cascading series of red flags on a global threat matrix. The first concrete reports of supply chain disruptions were landing. This was the domino effect in real time. Energy isn't just about heat and light, it's the bedrock of everything. No stable energy, no stable anything. The response was a classic Washington move: throw money and authority at the problem until it flinches. The Department of Energy, under direct orders, announced the first coordinated release from the Northeast Home Heating Oil Reserve and the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It was a symbolic shot across the bow, meant to calm jittery markets. But the real talk was happening in secure video conferences with CEOs of the remaining major LNG exporters. The ask was simple and brutal: reroute every available tanker, every spot cargo, to European terminals. The unspoken subtext: the Atlantic Alliance was now running on a literal gas-powered lifeline. But here's where the global ripple effect gets truly sinister. As analysts dug into the logistics, a more insidious pattern emerged. This wasn't just about the physical gas from the Aurora Borealis being offline. The lead here? The Aurora Borealis facility, the crown jewel of global LNG, is a smoldering ruin, and the human and economic cost is only beginning to be tallied. According to initial statements from Qatar Energy, the fire has been contained, but the complex is a total loss. The official death toll stands at 37, with over 120 injured, many critically. But sources close to the recovery operation whisper that number is expected to climb as crews sift through the structural carnage. The official line, delivered in a somber press conference, is one of resilience. A Qatar Energy spokesperson stated, "Our primary focus is on the families of our fallen colleagues and the injured. We are cooperating fully with the international investigation. The security of global energy supplies remains a paramount concern." Off camera, a senior Qatari official, speaking on condition of anonymity because they are not authorized to discuss timelines, drops the real news. Forget the market's hope for a 6-month turnaround. Forget the analyst predictions of a year. The initial engineering surveys suggest the liquefaction trains, the heart of the operation, are so catastrophically damaged that rebuilding from scratch is the only option. The facility, they say, may be offline for years, not months. We cut to an interview with Dr. Anya Sharma, a veteran LNG analyst with Wood Mackenzie, via satellite. "What you have to understand is that this isn't a repair job," she says, her voice crisp. "This is a demolition and reconstruction. The precision required in an LNG train is measured in millimeters. The heat from that blast would have warped foundational steel, compromised cryogenic integrity. You're looking at a 3 to 5 year timeline minimum, assuming no supply chain bottlenecks. And given the current global demand for such specialized materials and engineering, add another year." We speak to a Filipino contractor, his face etched with exhaustion, who was working a shift 2 miles away when the blast hit. "It was like the sun rose in the north," he says, his voice flat. "The ground shook. Then the sirens. Always the sirens here, but this was different." He hasn't been able to reach 3 of his cousins who were working inside the perimeter. The waiting families at the worker accommodations are a silent, desperate tableau. This is the POV the market reports never show, the human scaffolding that holds up the global energy empire. Back to the analysts. The long-term repair timeline isn't just a technical problem, it's a geopolitical earthquake. The years, not months declaration is a direct message to Europe and Asia, explains our second expert, former Shell strategist Marcus Thorne. It's Qatar saying, "The cavalry is not coming. Plan accordingly." The human cost was still being counted in Doha and Delhi, in Manila and Mumbai. But the geopolitical clock was ticking faster. While families waited for news outside worker camps, the world's intelligence agencies were already racing, sifting through digital debris and satellite feeds. The narrative was about to harden, and it would come not from a weeping relative, but from a podium in a well-lit briefing room thousands of miles away. This is where the story pivots from tragedy to potential tinderbox. We open cold. The White House press briefing room. The usual murmur dies as the national security advisor, a woman with a reputation for glacial precision, steps up. No pleasantries. She goes straight to the point. The United States, she states, presenting findings from a multi-agency investigation, has concluded with high confidence that the sabotage of the North Field expansion was not the work of a rogue actor or an accident. It was, she says, a deliberate state-sponsored act of economic warfare. And then she drops the name, The evidence, she claims, includes intercepted communications between military intelligence officers of a rival power discussing timing, methods, and the specific goal of crippling LNG capacity to sow discord among U.S. allies. She doesn't shout. She doesn't need to. The name of the accused nation hangs in the air, a silent detonation. The POV from the accused capital is one of immediate, furious denial. Within the hour, a senior foreign ministry official appears on state media, face a mask of indignation. The allegations are baseless and provocative, a transparent attempt to deflect from domestic failures and impose a false narrative. This is pure gaslighting on a global scale, he insists. But then comes the kicker, the line that freezes diplomats in their tracks. Our nation, he continues, staring directly into the camera, reserves the right to a swift and proportionate response to these malicious accusations. The word proportionate does all the work. It's not a denial of future action, it's a promise. It's the geopolitical equivalent of talk to the hand because the fist is busy. The market's reaction is instantaneous and brutal. This isn't the speculative dip from the initial attack. This is a full-blown panic sell. Trading floors from New York to Tokyo to Frankfurt become seas of flashing red. It's the fear premium made real. The FTSE, the DAX, the Nikkei all plunge, but the real carnage is in the commodities. Brent crude spikes over 15% in minutes, blowing past every price ceiling analysts had sketched out for a worst-case scenario. Natural gas futures in Europe, already astronomical, become a graph that looks like a sheer cliff face. The emergency session of the United Nations Security Council, meant to be the world's circuit breaker, has instead become its echo chamber. For hours, the chamber in New York echoed with the sound of diplomatic machinery grinding to a complete and utter halt. The ambassador from the Federation stood firm, repeating the line about proportionate response to unprovoked aggression, painting a picture of a nation merely defending its critical infrastructure. The Western Bloc, led by the US, UK, and France, presented declassified satellite imagery of the missile launch sites, calling it an undeniable act of war that demanded immediate and severe consequences. The deadlock was absolute. Any resolution for sanctions or condemnation was vetoed, predictably, leaving the council paralyzed. The real story, however, wasn't in the speeches. It was in the silence of certain key players and the frantic scribbling of aides passing notes. The energy war, it became clear, was just the opening salvo. While diplomats talked, armies moved. According to confidential briefings from NATO's intelligence wing obtained by our network, this is no longer just about pipelines and pumping stations. Satellite imagery over the past 48 hours shows a significant and concerning mobilization. Federation armored divisions, typically stationed for internal defense, have begun rolling westward in large-scale convoy exercises officially labeled training. But the positioning is telling. Simultaneously, alliance forces, including rapid deployment brigades from the United States, have accelerated their readiness drills along the eastern flank. We're seeing a sudden surge in flight activity from strategic bomber bases. This isn't posturing anymore. This is the chessboard being physically rearranged. The potential for a catastrophic miscalculation is now the single biggest fear in every world capital. A single skirmish between patrols in a disputed border region, a misinterpreted radar blip over the Black Sea, any spark could ignite a conventional conflict that everyone claims they don't want. The escalation ladder isn't being climbed rung by rung anymore, it's being jumped. The doctrine of proportionate response has a dark cousin, mission creep. What starts as a strike on a pipeline support ship could escalate to targeting coastal defense systems, then airfields, then command and control centers. The red lines blurred from the start have now vanished completely in the fog of this hybrid war. The mood in European capitals has shifted from economic anxiety to raw, cold dread. The call from the German chancellor for restraint on all sides this morning sounded less like diplomacy and more like a plea. The plea fell on deaf ears because while the diplomats were talking, the markets were screaming. This wasn't just about one pipeline anymore. This was the moment the world realized the quiet, decades-long war for resources had just gone hot. Welcome to the new era of resource warfare, where the weapons aren't just missiles, but supply chains, and the battlefield is the globalized network we all depend on. We open on a split screen. On one side, a tense press conference in Berlin. On the other, a live feed of natural gas futures. The numbers are a screaming red waterfall, a real-time EKG of geopolitical panic. The anchor's voice is cool, analytical, cutting through the noise. What we are witnessing is not an accident, but a fundamental stress test. A test that the entire post-Cold War system of energy interdependence is failing spectacularly. The first expert, a former NATO strategist, lays it out with brutal clarity. Deterrence failed. The whole concept was built on a clear, mutually understood threat of overwhelming conventional force. But how do you deter an attack that's deniable, that uses civilian contractors and ambiguous legal zones? You can't put a nuclear triad on a pipeline repair ship. The old rules of the game, he says, have been thrown out the window. The opponent isn't playing chess. They're playing a different game entirely, and we're still moving our pawns in straight lines. Cut to an energy economist from a top-tier university. She calls it the fragility of efficiency. For 30 years, we optimized the global energy network for cost and just-in-time delivery. We built a magnificent interconnected machine, but we forgot to armor it. We forgot to build in redundancy. A single point of failure in the Baltic, she explains, sends shockwaves through German factories, hikes heating bills in Portugal, and forces emergency LNG shipments from Qatar that then ripple through Asian markets. The system is so efficient, it has no slack, no buffer. It's a house of cards in a hurricane. The debate turns to the core question: was this inevitable? A geopolitical risk analyst, H.O. argues yes. The era of cheap, easy energy from stable regions is over. What's left are resources in contested spaces: the Arctic, the South China Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, the deep sea beds. The competition was always there, simmering. The Nord Stream attacks, he posits, are simply the first major skirmish where the covert competition broke into overt physical sabotage. This is the logical endpoint of hybrid warfare. You test cyber defenses, you fund disinformation, and eventually you go for the physical infrastructure that powers your rival's economy. But another voice, a professor of international law, pushes back. The professor of international law pushed back hard. He said this wasn't some inevitable geopolitical chess move. This was a crime, a deliberate act of terrorism against critical civilian infrastructure. Calling it hybrid warfare was just a fancy way to gaslight the world into accepting a new, lawless normal where pipelines are fair game. Governments were in emergency sessions, not to assign blame. That was a diplomatic minefield no one was ready to cross publicly yet, but to answer one terrifying question: what now? The search for energy security became an all-consuming trillion-dollar scavenger hunt. LNG tankers from the US and Qatar became the most important ships on the planet, their routes watched like military assets. Germany, in a stunning policy reversal, was fast-tracking LNG import terminals on its North Sea coast, something unthinkable just months before. The term energy independence was no longer a green dream. It was a national security mantra. This was the new global uncertainty. It wasn't just about who blew up the pipes. It was about the fundamental rewiring of trust. If undersea cables could be cut, if pipelines could be crippled, what was safe? The globalized economy, that delicate web of just-in-time shipping and interconnected grids, was suddenly looking incredibly fragile. The economic impact was immediate and brutal. European industries, especially the chemical and manufacturing giants, started announcing temporary shutdowns. A global recession wasn't a risk anymore. It was the baseline forecast. Geopolitically, the map was being redrawn in real time. Alliances were stress-tested. Meanwhile, non-aligned players saw an opportunity. Turkey positioned itself as a new energy hub. Azerbaijan's gas became suddenly more valuable, and China, watching the West fracture over energy, quietly accelerated its own deals, locking down long-term supplies from Russia and Central Asia, playing the long game while everyone else was in crisis mode. The lasting impact? It's the end of an era. The post-Cold War assumption that economic interdependence would prevent major conflict is now in the ICU. Energy is no longer just a commodity, it's a weapon, a tool of coercion, the ultimate geopolitical leverage. The world has fractured into energy blocks: the Atlantic LNG block, the Eurasian pipeline block, and everyone else fighting for scraps. So, to the core question, was this inevitable? From the analyst's chair, the cold answer is yes. The conditions were perfect. A system pushed to its limits, decades of underinvestment, and rivalries that had festered in the shadows. The Nord Stream attacks were the spark. But the tinder was already there, piled high by short-sighted policy and a dangerous comfort with dependency.